Landfall by Joseph N. Wdowski. Miller Smith to command. Gil requested for the first time in 23 years. May I go with you? Zhang Hu asked. I always wanted to see the command center. Gil didn't say I couldn't bring someone. Miller Smith looked across the chessboard, answering her. The others in the recreation room did not seem curious about joining them as they stood to leave. Do you think we are finally there? She asked as they entered the main corridor of habitation sphere. I don't think so, but we must be close. They walked up the curvature of the corridor. The whole midsection was a giant sphere that rotated fast enough to create 1G. It would give them a slight advantage when they reached RD 2024 B, which was estimated to have a gravitational force of 89% of Earth's gravity. The command center was located at the bow of the ship that did not rotate. Entering one of the two access shafts to the bow and aft sections, they left the spinning sphere and entered 0G. Grabbing railings along the bulkhead, they pulled their floating bodies towards the command center. Miller Smith entered first. The empty chairs at the functioning flight control stations gave the command center an eerie ghost ship feel. Gil, what is it? Miller Smith, please take your station at Flight Control 1, the disembodied voice requested. Miller Smith did as the ship's computer requested and strapped himself in. Zhang Hu at the same time strapped herself in at the control station next to him. Out the main command center's large window, they could view the red dwarf star in the distance. It appeared like a small shimmering red ball of fire. The planet they were approaching was still too far to see as a world. With only the naked eye, it appeared merely as an extremely bright star. By making their approach from the direction of the star, they would use the red dwarf's gravitational pull to help slow down the ship. And he looked around as if trying to see the Gilbert mainframe G2108. Monitor, the computer responded. I think you are just here as a precautionary procedure, she told him as she looked at the panel before him. Firing bow Vasimar engines, the computer announced. Miller Smith noted as the panel displayed the firing of the 4-bow variable specific impulse magnetoplasma rockets. Out the command window at each corner of their eyes, 4 large superheated hydrogen plasma plumes jetted forward. The flight station indicated that hydrogen plasma was being expelled at a rate of 250,000 miles per hour. From the readings, it would still take nearly 2 days for the ship to decelerate to its approach speed. When the engines were finished, their remaining hydrogen reserves would be nearly depleted. The I.E.C. Susan Constant was designed for a one-way trip. Thank you for your assistance, said the computer. You're welcome. Miller Smith felt weird for being thanked when he did not actually do anything. He suddenly felt gravity pulling him back into his chair. Gil, why am I feeling gravity? It is the sensation from deceleration. The whole ship will experience 1G until reaching our approach speed, Gil answered. I have already halted the rotation of the habitation sphere, meaning the bulkheads will now be the decks. I positioned the sphere in order that living quarters still have gravity, along with the recreation room and the mess. Educational, conference room, medical bay, and sporting rooms will not be accessible until the deceleration process is completed. Understood, he replied as he climbed out of the command chair. He helped Zhang Hu make the transition to the new posture of the ship as they both climbed down the command center to the access core. Using the handles built into the bulkhead, he now understood that they were there as the rungs of a ladder, not to just help them pull themselves through 0G. It is too bad we cannot notify Earth that we have finally made it. Zhang Hu climbed down after him. He looked up at her, even if the ship had not lost her entire communications array when she passed through the Oort cloud. It would take at least 7 years before our transmission would even reach Earth. There must be some way to notify them, she insisted. She looked away from Miller Smith and up around her. Gil. Yes, Zhang Hu? Is there any way, she asked, knowing the ship's computer was monitoring their conversation. All communications with Earth were lost in 2133 due to the loss of the ship's communications array when it was struck by an asteroid within the Oort cloud. Yes, I know that, but is there any other way? Once arriving at our destination, a communications facility will be constructed. The ship's computer began to list its programmed mission objectives. First, a proper location on the surface will be established for Colony 1, New Jamestown. Second, construction bots are to build a temporary habitat for the first hatchlings. Third, agricultural domes are to be manufactured and crops planted. Fourth, livestock embryo germination facilities are to be constructed and activated. Fifth, understood. Miller Smith cut off the computer from reciting its entire list of mission objectives. They finally reached the hatch into the habitation sphere. It was at a right angle to their position. On their way back, they started to crawl, not climb, into the habitat. He let her enter the short tunnel first. We have heard this all before. You know we will not be able to let Earth know until we establish New Jamestown. Reaching the end of the tube, a small ladder extended for them to climb down to the curved deck below. The rest of the way they were able to walk normally. Returning to the recreation center, they found most of the others. Of the first 30 embryos, 25 of them had successfully matured and were all in their 23rd year of life. It was determined by those that had launched the interstellar embryo colonizer Susan Constant that 23 would be the peak age for the crew to supervise the primary goal of the mission. At this age, they would have full frontal lobe development and would also be in their prime physical condition to oversee the construction of humanity's first colony on an exoplanet. The main cargo of the I.E.C. Susan Constant was the second group of hatchlings, 300 embryos that had just begun their germination process. In the early 22nd century, artificial intelligence was still not to the level of the fully developed human mind. AI could not match the human brain's talents for creativity or intuition. The bots the Susan Constant carried would do most, if not all, the work in the construction of the colony. The first hatchlings were there merely to monitor and intervene only if necessary. They were the backup system, responsible for resourceful solutions to problems the Earth's AI programmers, 7 light years and over 8 centuries away, were unable to foresee. So, an attractive young woman walked up to them. Her hair was dark and wavy. Her coffee brown eyes were large, framed by long, thick natural lashes. "We are slowing down," Miller Smith answered as he sat back down at the chess table he and Zhang Hu had been playing. He noted how well a job Gil had done in positioning and stopping the sphere's rotation, that their game pieces were hardly disturbed. "That means we are approaching our destination?" Wirtz Wasserman asked as her right eye slightly twitched, as it often did from time to time. "We have been in the star system for the past few months. From what I read on the display panels, we're only a month out from landfall." He did not look at her as he studied the board moving his bishop. "I have been reading," Wirtz Wasserman stated. "As you should," Miller Smith answered, watching, as Zhang Hu put a finger on one of her knights, as she examined the board before committing to a move. "No, I mean I have been reading more than just our assigned text," she clarified, taking a seat. "What have you been reading?" asked Zhang Hu after she finally made her move. "I've been reading about the first Susan Constant and the first Jamestown." "Anne," Miller Smith asked, having already read the same subject back when he was 9. When he was first curious of the original sailing ship, their sublight star vessel was named after. The Jamestown colony was the first successful English colony in the New World. She told them, as if they had not known this already. Yes, tobacco was the cash crop that finally made the colony economically feasible. Miller Smith said, as he countered Zhang Hu's move on the chessboard check. But did you also realize that by the Europeans finally establishing a successful colony in the Americas, it led to the destruction of the way of life for the Aborigines? She pointed out. You mean the Native Americans? Zhang Hu asked. Yes, Wirtz Wasserman confirmed. Your point, WW? Miller Smith watched Zhang Hu move one of her bishops to protect her king. Don't you see, if we colonize this new world, we will be doing the same thing. She pointed out what she thought was already obvious. How is that? There is no evidence of intelligent life on RD 2024b. He countered Zhang Hu's move by taking her bishop. Check. Just because they did not pick up radio transmissions from there doesn't mean the world doesn't have cognitive life. The Aborigines of the Americas also did not have radio technology. Are you suggesting they should have sent a probe here first, before sending out a colony ship? It would have taken them the same 800 years for a probe to arrive here. Clearly, there was no sign of advanced life. What information they did have on this planet was determined from light spectrum analysis. RD 2024. B is in the Goldilocks zone of RD 2024, meaning liquid water. It has a mass similar to Earth's and high levels of oxygen in the atmosphere, meaning there is breathable air and most likely plant life on the planet. It is a perfect exoplanet close enough to Earth for our first settlement, he said to Wirtz Wasserman as he studied the chessboard after Zhang Hu moved her king out of harm's way. But I feel that if there is intelligent life there, it is not our right to settle on their world. Wirtz Wasserman continued before Miller Smith could reply. Even if there isn't any intelligent life, I feel our presences may hamper the natural evolutionary development of its indigenous life. So, Miller Smith turned his attention for the first time away from the game, looking directly at Wirtz Wasserman. Are you advocating after a $500 billion investment to build the Susan Constant, and over 800 years to reach our destination, we should not make landfall? I just feel there are important issues that were not considered by those that launched this ship. You know, we do not have the supplies or the means to return to Earth, he asked her in all seriousness. Even if we could, none of us would live long enough to even see Earth. Yes, 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 she started to get agitated. I know all that, but I never agreed to go on this mission. None of us had, Zhang Hu injected unemotionally. Well, I feel the builders did not respect the moral dilemma they have put us in, she answered Zhang Hu. WW, you know as well as any of us that if the human race is to survive in this universe, having all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, is not a good strategy. One large enough rogue meteor could wipe out the Earth's population like the dinosaurs. It is imperative that humanity colonize the stars. Zhang Hu added, for nearly 150 years, Earth had scanned the heavens for signs of other intelligent life. Not once had they picked up anything. Humanity may be the only intelligent life in the universe. Isn't it our duty then to make sure we survive? Perhaps it is our destiny to go extinct as the dinosaurs did. Wirtz Wasserman suggested. Where are you getting these ideas? Miller Smith asked her. They are my feelings, she defended, and I have been researching the anti-colony movement prior to our launch. Groups like PETA, Pink, the Greens, E.I. E.I. questioned Zhang Hu. End human imperialism. They were a social justice, vegan, environmentalist purity movement, she explained to Zhang Hu. There were also some radical religious groups. They believed that God created the cosmic speed limit and the vastness of space for a reason. They thought man was given the earth, no less, no more. They were clearly nuts, but the other groups did have just and morally superior reasons to oppose this mission. You realize they were all fringe groups? Miller Smith pointed out to her. Wirtz Wasserman, frustrated and upset that Miller Smith was not taking her seriously, suddenly got up and stormed out of the recreation room. Perhaps you should apologize to her, suggested Zhang Hu. For what? You hurt her feelings. She always getting her feelings hurt. After all these years, you would think she would learn to deal with opposing opinions. And you, after all these years, know what a sensitive person she is. You didn't have to be so curt with her. Were you listening to what she was advocating? He asked her. She expects us to do what? Not make landfall once we arrive? Just live out our lives on this ship until our resources are exhausted? Because she fears we may interfere with the evolutionary potential of some alien tree slug? Miller Smith smirked at the idea as he made his final move. Checkmate. Day 24 before landfall. Having reached their approach speed, the ship's configuration returned to its normal state. The habitation sphere was spinning again to create 1G forces for all its facilities. The bow and the much larger aft section of the Susan Constant were back to their states of 0G. Housed in the aft section were the 300 embryos, 5,000 livestock embryos, grain seed storage bays, the primary fission reactor electric generator, life support systems, and the aft engines that had originally propelled them to their top acceleration speed of 8 million miles per hour. The Susan Constant was the fastest ship ever made by man, yet even at her fastest velocity she had traveled at a mere fraction of light speed. Tanks of fresh water encircled the primary hull of the ship's rear section. The tanks of water were far beyond the needs of the crew. Most of their water usage was recycled and reused over and over again. The primary purpose of the water tanks were to shield the human and animal embryos from cosmic radiation. Hydrogen and oxygen could also be extracted from the water as an emergency reserve. The rear section also housed the hangar bays for the shuttlecraft they would be used to descend to the new world. In the rear section, in a dormant state, 200 security, mining, construction, agriculture, manufacture, and service bots were also stored. More bots would be manufactured once New Jamestown was established. Only 20 bots had been activated shortly before the germination of the first hatchlings, 10 agricultural and 10 service. Their responsibility was to the well-being of the first hatchlings. It is amazing how many ways they can cook chicken. Wallowitz Prager stated as he received his dinner tray from a galley service bot. Not all of us like eating chicken. Kim Lee replied, refusing the chicken and taking only the rice and vegetables. As large as the Susan is, we don't have the space to germinate the cattle or pig embryos for our sole consumption, Miller Smith stated. I am not interested in eating any meat, Kim Lee answered. Since when? Wallowitz Prager asked as they sat at one of the 6 dining tables in the mess. Since WW told me about her research of the anti-colony movement, she answered. Not you too? Miller Smith looked at her in disbelief. Don't tell me you also think we shouldn't make landfall? Don't make landfall? Confused Wallowitz Prager stopped before placing a forkful of chicken into his mouth. I had a conversation with WW a few days ago. She was advocating that we don't make landfall, he explained to Wallowitz Prager. Zhang Hu nodded, confirming what Miller Smith was saying. She can't be serious. It's just cabin fever talking. Wallowitz Prager took a bite of his chicken. She makes some valid points, Kim Lee replied, although I am not in complete agreement with her. I am switching to a vegetarian diet for health reasons, not political. Is there something wrong with your health? Wallowitz Prager chewed his chicken. I feel I have gained weight. She touched her near flat belly. Well, if you have, it is all in the right places. Wallowitz Prager smiled as he eyed her chest, not her belly. I agree with WP, Zhang Hu chimed in. You look wonderful, KL, doesn't she, MS? She looked at Miller Smith, encouraging to also compliment the young woman. Yes, KL, you look wonderful. Miller Smith was starting to get impatient with the constant need to maintain the fragile feelings of his fellow crew members. There were times he wished it was only him and the bots on board. Granted, he did enjoy a game of chess at times, but he could always play chess against Gil. Even if Gil would always win. There was sex. He had to admit he would miss having sex. The 5 hatchlings of their group, that had failed to germinate were all males. It was a problem the builders had not foreseen. Having 15 females to only 10 males did have its advantages, at least the male crewmates felt so. On the downside, especially when they were in their teens, it did cause jealousy and rivalry issues among the female members. What the builders did foresee was that the first hatchlings would reach sexual maturity while cramped on an interstellar ship for years. For at least a decade, the first hatchlings would be in close quarters with other young adults, sexually mature biologically, with raging hormones, yet without any human adult supervision. It was highly likely the first hatchlings would become sexually active at a much younger age than most of their contemporaries back on Earth. It was determined it would not be advantageous to the mission if the first hatchlings began having offspring while still on board the Susan Constant. Their immature ages were not ideal for taking on the responsibility of children. Any additional children would also put a great strain on the vessel's limited living spaces and resources. Their solution to the problem was to genetically alter the first hatchling embryos. None of them would be able to reproduce. As for the main group of embryos, who would be born and raised on RD 2024, it was their mission's objective to reproduce, to seed the alien world, to be fruitful and multiply. The first hatchings, a generation older, would be foster parents to the 300. Miller Smith, though, was not confident that all his fellow first hatchlings were emotionally and psychologically equipped for such an important task. He was beginning to think that their having only programmed bots and the ship's computer as their sole role models was a major drawback in the builder's mission plan. Day 20 before landfall, all 25 were at their personal study stations in the education reference room. Miller Smith was reviewing his required studies of Socratic philosophy. Through his headset, he was conversing with the computer-generated image on his touchscreen as if he was speaking with the real Socrates of ancient Athens. Should a leader censor what his subjects view or read? Miller Smith asked. Can any leader be all-knowing? Asked Socrates. Of course not, but what if his subjects are being subverted by incorrect information? How can a leader, who is not all-knowing, know the information is incorrect? Socrates responded. By the information being harmful. Miller Smith answered. Harmful to whom, the subjects or the leader? Socrates asked. To either. Can leaders be wrong? Yes, of course. So, is it possible the information may actually help understand what is true? Yes, it is possible. He had to agree with the Athenian philosopher. And is not truth beneficial? Yes, truth should always be our goal. Science is the constant quest for truth, to even test and retest what is already perceived to be true. Leadership, though, has to consider more than just science. He challenged the sage. What is the obligation of the leader? Is it to maintain his authority, or is it to best serve his subjects? To best serve his subjects, Miller Smith answered the bearded Athenian on his monitor. How then can a good leader best serve his subjects if he denies them access to the truth? What if it is not the truth? Miller Smith rebutted. What is the best way to discover if something is true or not? Socrates asked. Through logic and reason, Miller Smith replied. And what is the best method to utilize logic and reason? Through questioning and dialogue. The 23-year-old mission commander answered. I ask you, can one have a reasonable dialogue if one of the parties is not allowed full access to all information, and is even forbidden from asking certain questions? Socrates stroked his simulated gray whiskers. They cannot. Miller Smith had to concur. Miller Smith felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Trumbull Monroe, a brown-haired young man attempting to grow a beard. Miller Smith took off his headsets and turned to face the ship's mission specialist. Sorry to interrupt you, MS, but I think you should check this out. What is it, TM? The young man only gestured with a waving motion for Miller Smith to follow him. Miller Smith followed him to the conference room, where he found four of the crewmen sharing an interactive historical creation of the Austin, Texas protest against the launching of the construction components for the not yet completed I.E.C. Susan Constant. A University of Texas at Austin professor was speaking at a podium set up at Graffiti Park. He wore dreadlocks and a tattoo of the anarchy symbol on his shaved left temple. We have already raped and pillaged our own world, and now they want to destroy another world with the plague of humanity? The crowd of a few thousand roared with approval. Miller Smith walked up to the small group end program. The holographic image shut down. You had no right to do that, MS, protested Hoffman Houston. Miller Smith stood before the four crewmen that included Wirtz Wasserman. We all know what the position of the anti-colony movement was. I do not see how rehashing these arguments benefit anyone. Hoffman Houston stood up and faced the mission's commander. We think it should be explored deeper. The young man, a little bit shorter than Miller Smith, replied. This ship will make landfall in 20 days. Nothing is going to change that, Miller Smith replied. Those protesters have been dead for centuries. So have the builders. Wirtz Wasserman stood beside Hoffman Houston. I have no objections to you studying this material. I will not delete it from our memory core. But for now, you should be concentrating on your studies in the construction of New Jamestown. After we settle, you'll have more than enough time to study this period of history. Miller Smith tried to get his crewmen to refocus on their mission. The other two crewmen who had been watching stood up and went back to their study stations in the next room. Hoffman Houston and Wirtz Wasserman were defiant until they saw that Trumbull Monroe was standing behind Miller Smith in support. They reluctantly finally returned to their study stations too. Day 15 before landfall. Miller Smith was at the back mess table having his dinner with Zhang Hu and Wolowitz Prager when a small group approached the table. MS, we need to talk to you. Hoffman Houston spoke for the group of five. Miller Smith put down his utensils and looked up at the small group. What is it now, H.H.? We want a vote of confidence in your command. Wirtz Wasserman answered for Hoffman Houston. Why should you be deciding all our fates and the fates of this pristine alien world? The builders chose me. Miller Smith stood from the table walking around it to face them. My egg donor was President Joan Miller, who ended the Earth's Great Global Depression of the late 21st century. My sperm donor was Admiral Omar Smith, the victor of the Battle of the East China Sea, and the military governor that oversaw the democratizing China. Your pedigree is no reason for you to be our leader. Not in a democratic society. Wirtz Wasserman pointed one of her fingers forcefully at Miller Smith. This is not a democracy, not yet. Not until New Jamestown is established. Miller Smith felt his patience beginning to erode away. Wolowitz Prager stood beside Miller Smith, giving his support to the commander. This is still an interstellar vessel with only one commander, chosen by those that built her and launched her. What is your objection? Zhang Hu asked the group as she too stood beside Miller Smith. Where has MS not seen to our needs? How has he not looked to the success of this mission? It is his desire for the success of this mission we object to. Hoffman Houston responded. The others in the group voiced support. Have you all gone insane? Wolowitz Prager was also losing his patience with the group. Are you seriously suggesting we do not make landfall and die on this ship? We are suggesting that we make a compromise. Owen Stenval, a very handsome, tall, blond young man, calmly replied, trying to diffuse the anger that was growing on both sides. What compromise? Miller Smith asked. We make landfall. We live out our lives at New Jamestown. Owen Stenval began to explain. But, Miller Smith interrupted, but we don't germinate the other embryos. Wirtz Wasserman answered. That defeats the whole purpose of this mission. Miller Smith responded. Exactly. Hoffman Houston said as other crewmen in the mess began to gather around the groups. If we abort the 300 embryos who have not been genetically sterilized, we alone would not be a threat to the development of any indigenous life on the planet. You want to kill the 300? Asked one of the crew members that joined to listen to the heated discussion. It is not killing, Wirtz Wasserman answered the newcomer. They are only embryos. They are alive, Zhang Hu pointed out. Human life, the newcomer De Rosa Rosario added. Of the first 30 hatchlings, only 25 of us developed well enough for birthing. The 300 are only potential human life. They are not living people. What of all our livestock embryos? Asked Wallowitz Prager, who was actually looking forward to trying something different than just chicken. They too would have to be aborted, Wirtz Wasserman stated. If we allowed them to mature, they too could be a threat to the local ecosystem. There is nothing wrong with us all being vegetarians. I feel it is actually healthier for us. Kim Lee stated as she entered the dialogue. Plant life can also threaten local ecosystems, answered Miller Smith. We demand a vote of confidence. Hoffman Houston changed the subject, not having a reply to Miller Smith. Or are you just a tyrant and we are merely your servants? Don't we have a right to decide our own destinies? That is true. None of us chose to be on this mission. Another person that had gathered to listen spoke up. All the crewmen began to argue with each other. Fine, Miller Smith shouted, getting control of the room. You want self-determination? You want to choose your own destinies? We demand it, responded Wirtz Wasserman. Her twitch seemed worse than usual. Then this is my compromise. Miller Smith spoke to everyone. Those that wish not to be part of this mission may stay on board the Susan. The rest of us will see to the completion of this mission, as the builders planned. Most of the crewmen murmured in agreement to Miller Smith compromise. That is not good enough. Wirtz Wasserman rejected the compromise. We wish to protect this world from human exploitation. Miller Smith forcefully walked up to Wirtz Wasserman and stared her down. Then you are not looking for individual self-determination. You are the ones actually wishing to dictate all our destinies, not just your own, and looked also at Hoffman Houston. Hoffman Houston sighed, deeply turned his back on Miller Smith, and stumped out of the mess. Wirtz Wasserman followed him with the others in their group. Day 10 before landfall. Miller Smith floated in mid-air, looking over the embryos. He learned from Gil that 262 of the 300 were still viable. Zhang Hu floated into the embryo chamber. Gil said I would find you back here. Why are you here? Miller Smith turned to her. I wanted to be alone. No one else ever comes back here. I'm sorry, do you want me to leave? No, he grabbed her about her thin waist and pulled her close to him. Have you ever done it in 0G? You know as well as I do, it is very difficult to do it in 0G, she answered. Yes, I know. He tightened his hold around her as she responded by wrapping her arms around him. Every thrust to bring us together causes a counter-reaction to separate us. She kissed him as she wrapped her legs around him too. We could try if you want. Only gripping each other, they had no control of their drift. It resulted in Miller Smith hitting the back of his head on the corner of a bulkhead, forcing him to free one of his hands from her to take hold of something to anchor them. I wish I could have children with you. She tightened her hold of him. We already have many children. He looked at the columns of artificial wombs before them. If WW gets her way, they will not reach birthing, Zhang Hu answered him. She is not going to get her way. Her support is increasing, she warned. I am even starting to understand her concerns. She may be right. He was astonished to hear this from her. You think we should abort them? I didn't say that. She let go of her grip of him and drifted off until she took hold of something. Although I do agree they are not yet human life. Even if that were true, what if humanity has been wiped out back on Earth? A lot could have happened in over 800 years. It may not have been a meteor, but it could have been a nuclear war, a pandemic. Anything is possible. Those maturing embryos, he pointed to the rows of artificial wombs, may be all that is left of the human race. Its only future. You do not know that, she answered. Earth could be fine. Do you know that it is? Well, no, I don't. They are alive in those wombs. They can reproduce, as you know we cannot. She moved in close to him and took a hold of him again with all her limbs. MS, I didn't say I agreed with her. I just said I understood her concerns. She kissed him, cooling down his temper, as she knew she could. Day 7 before landfall. RD 2024. B took shape as a world in the command center's observation window. With the red dwarf behind them, Miller Smith and Zhang Hu could make out the large land masses and oceans of the planet. If not for the alien landmass configurations, the world looked very much like Earth. White clouds gently swirled in its atmosphere, covering much of the surface. It is very beautiful, Zhang Hu said as she took Miller Smith's hand. It is hard to believe that after traveling so long, we will soon be making landfall. This time next week, we will be standing on solid ground with vast skies above us. We'll finally feel the wind on our faces, perhaps even raindrops on our cheeks, he told her. MS, I feel excited and yet a little afraid. She looked at the world before them. I understand how you feel. He held her hand a little tighter. It will not be long, though, that you think of this world as home. He turned and looked at her. Our home. She smiled. Miller Smith, we have a problem in the embryo chamber, Gil interrupted. Yes, he looked up to address the disembodied voice. We just lost life support for 2 artificial wombs. They unbuckled themselves and headed for the rear section of the ship down the ship's access core. How? Wesserman Wirtz and Hoffman Houston are aborting the embryos. Lock down all manual controls in the embryo chamber. I would need the command code. Miller, Smith, command 19860714. He gave the code. Ahead of them they could see Wolowitz-Prager's head emerge from 1G. What the hell are they doing? Wolowitz-Prager asked as he was followed by Trumbull Monroe, DeRosa Rosario, and Jefferson Clay. It seems they decided to take things into their own hands. Miller Smith answered, not stopping, but continuing to push himself down the access core to the rear of the large ship. The others followed him, pushing hard to keep up. They finally reached the embryo chamber. Wirtz Wasserman was scolding Hoffman Houston, override the manual lockout. I can't, he answered. Wolowitz-Prager and DeRosa Rosario took a hold of Wirtz Wasserman. Trumbull Monroe and Jefferson Clay easily subdued the smaller Hoffman Houston. We will not let you infest that world. Wirtz Wasserman spat at Miller Smith, her arms pinned behind her by Wolowitz-Prager. How could you do such a thing, WW? Zhang Hu questioned her. How could we not? She replied. It is our social duty to prevent this illegal conquest of that world. Confine them to their quarters, Miller Smith ordered. Day 4 before landfall. Miller Smith was awoken by a loud banging on his cabin hatch. Raising from bed, he slipped on a pair of shorts. Zhang Hu also woke, sitting up in the bed, covering herself with the bed sheet while Miller Smith opened the hatch. He found Owen Stenval and 2 other crew members standing before him. We demand you release WW and HH from cabin confinement. We, he asked. Yes, we. One of the female crewmen standing beside Owen Stenval answered. You have no right placing them under arrest. The other supporter spoke up. They killed 2 embryos and would have killed them all if we had not stopped them, he responded. Owen Stenval suddenly gave a Miller Smith an uppercut to the jaw. Miller Smith went down as Zhang Hu screamed, calling for help. The others rushed into the room, grabbing hold of Miller Smith. They picked him up and slammed him hard against one of his cabin bulkheads. We want those command codes. I will not give them to you. Miller Smith, defiantly replied, still in pain from the unexpected assault. Owen Stenval punched him hard to the upper gut, knocking the wind out of Miller Smith. We want those codes. I'll give you the codes. Stop hurting him. Zhang Hu begged, clutching the bed sheet tighter around her. Owen Stenval turned to face her. What is it? Before she could reply, Wolowitz Prager and Trumbull Monroe rushed in. Both were armed. Enough. Let go. Other crew members, not armed, stood outside in support of the commander. Those holding Miller Smith complied. Miller Smith dropped to the floor, trying to get his wind back. Not caring who saw her, naked Zhang Hu rushed to his side. You bastards! She began to cry as she helped Miller Smith to his feet and to the bed. Wolowitz Prager gestured with his weapon for them to raise their hands above their heads. I should flush you all out an airlock. No, Miller Smith answered, finally getting enough breath to speak. Go release Wirtz Wasserman and Hoffman Houston. Why? Trumbull Monroe asked. They spent enough time in confinement. I was planning to release them today anyway, he answered, still reeling in pain. But before you do, place these three under cabin arrest. Half rations. He then stood and looked directly at Owen Stenval, holding back his urge to strike him in revenge. Quarter rations for OS. Day 3 before landfall. Miller Smith addressed all the first hatchlings. He allowed Owen Stenval and the other two that had attacked him freed from cabin confinement. He asked everyone to sit facing him as he sat on top of one of the mess tables. I want to forget what has happened these last few days. We are the only family any of us have. From my studies, even families have their falling outs. I know there are those among us who have moral objections to our mission. As we already know, those debates were played out over 8 centuries ago. The builders that launched the Susan understood that for humanity to survive, we need to reach out and colonize other worlds. It is not our right, Wirtz Wasserman shouted out. We are going to establish New Jamestown. If you and your group cannot accept that, I am sorry. But it is going to happen. Most in the mess clapped in support of Miller Smith. You said before you wanted a vote of confidence. Wolowitz Prager spoke up. That was your vote of confidence in MS and in our mission. Another round of applause came from the majority of first hatchlings. Wirtz Wasserman and her small group did not clap. What of it, WW? I am willing to put all this behind us. Are you? Miller Smith asked her. HOS, any of you? The small group of dissenters said nothing. None made any gesture to mend with Miller Smith. We have our principles, Wirtz Wasserman finally responded. It dumbfounds me how the rest of you can be so reckless. Don't you understand what you will be doing? This is a world unspoiled by humans. If we establish New Jamestown, if we germinate that army of invaders, she pointed in what she thought was the direction of the embryo chambers. We will all be guilty of global genocide. De Rosa Rosario answered her. It is man's destiny that we should colonize this planet and all the planets. God gave us the means to venture out into the stars. He gave us this world to inhabit. Wirtz Wasserman turned to De Rosa Rosario with an expression of complete disdain. You're insane. I may not have DR's religious devotion, but I do agree with him that we do have a destiny. Those embryos are depending on us. The future of humanity may be depending on us. Miller Smith stood and approached Wirtz Wasserman and her group. He reached out his hand to her. She refused his hand. This is not over. She turned her back on him and led her followers out of the room. Day 2 before landfall. According to the ship's internal clock, it was 3 in the morning when Miller Smith and Zhang Hu were awoken by sirens and flashing lights. A holographic image of abandoned ship in bright red lettering was projected in the center of the room. Gil, what is it? Both he and Zhang Hu got out of bed and began dressing as quickly as they could. Meltdown of main reactor core definite. The ship's computer answered. Proceed to nearest life pod. They ran out the cabin still dressing on their way. Gil, how? How could this happen? He screamed to the disembodied voice. Other crewmen, also half-dressed, filled the main habitat corridor to the life pods. Wirtz Wasserman had entered the reactor core, destroying the cooling system. The computer answered without emotion. Wirtz Wasserman on her own had been attempting to radiate the embryos, hoping to abort them. Unfortunately for her, she lost control, causing a fire and triggering a meltdown in the main reactor. Miller Smith and Zhang Hu reached one of the pods. Just as they opened the hatch, explosions reverberated through the ship as the sphere lost its rotation and gravity. Miller struggled to get a hold of Zhang Hu as they both instantly began to free float. More explosions, sounding even closer, almost shook loose their grasp of each other. He held her tighter. "Hold me," he shouted to her. With all his strength, he swung her into the open life pod. The Susan shook even more violently as even closer explosions went off. This time they lost their grip of each other, and Miller Smith was hurled away from the life pod. He could feel the heat of fire behind him. "Gil, close pod hatch and launch." Miller Smith ordered the ship's computer. "No," was the last word he heard from Zhang Hu as the hatch locked into place, and the pod was jettisoned from the crippled body of the I.E.C. Susan Constant. In complete silence, the ship that traveled for over 8 centuries exploded, destroyed by the one thing the builders did not anticipate. Landfall. Zhang Hu's pod heated up as it entered the atmosphere. She could hear the rush of air and flames outside her life pod. Retro-rockets fired, slowing her descent. The pod jerked suddenly as its parachutes deployed. Just as suddenly, the pod hit the surface and rolled a few yards until it came to a complete stop. Zhang Hu did not unbuckle herself at first. She just sat there. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the empty seat across from her. Her emotions were overwhelmed with all the loss. A loss of their 8 centuries long mission, the loss of the embryos, and worse of all, the loss of Miller Smith. She tried to wipe away her tears as she finally unbuckled herself. She flipped the switch guard and hit the jettison button for the pod's hatch to blow above her. The explosive bolts threw the hatch up and away from the pod. Throwing a survival kit on her back, she looked up to see for her first time blue skies with soft white clouds. An alien bird crowed as it flew high above. She took a deep breath of her first sample of fresh air through the open hatch. It was amazing. Closing her eyes, she poked her head out, feeling a cool breeze and the warmth of sunlight on her face. She could hear more birds and the rustle of the wind in the trees near her landing. Opening her eyes, she was overwhelmed by the sheer beauty of the green valley she landed in. A sparkling light blue river worked its way through the valley from snow-peaked mountains in the distance. She pulled herself up and sat on the edge of the hatchway. To her surprise, when she turned to begin her climb down the pod, a flying machine came from above the tree line. On its nose, written clearly in big white letters, was the word "Rescue." The machine, with a low murmur of engines, landed softly in front of her. Several people stepped out of the machine, some with red crosses on their caps and shoulder patches. Some were her fellow crewmates. A man leading the group approached her. "Zhang Hu." "Yes," she answered, confused. "You're human." "Yes, very much so," the man answered, offering to help her down from the pod. She took his hand and climbed down. "But how? We were the first ship launched from Earth? Faster than light travel was discovered about 2 centuries after your launch. RD 2024. B was settled over 600 years ago. We have a population of nearly 500 million, he explained to her. I'm sorry we couldn't have reached you sooner. We don't have ships approaching us from so far out. Any ships from Earth usually just drops out of hyperspace right into orbit. We didn't notice your ship until we detected its destruction a day ago. Still in flight, we were able to rescue 22 of your fellow crewmates. I don't understand. You made it, Zhang Hu. Welcome to RD 2024B, or as we like to call it, New Plymouth Rock. The end.